Hello，大家好啊，又係我高 B 哥啊，係時間提醒大家飲水啦，增添智慧，增添水分，智慧如水啊！好啦，嚟到錄片時間，2025年嘅5月10號嘅凌晨啊，高 B 哥咧今日咧睇咗呢條影片咧，覺得好精彩，咁所以咧想同大家咧分享下。咁啊，畫面上面咧，你應該見到咧，就係一位咧，就係呢排咧非常出位嘅高志凱教授啊！係咪教授我都唔記得，高志凱啦 ，OK？ 咁啊，佢啊爆咗句金句就 We don't care, we don't care， 即係話如果咧你咧再係咁樣咧，同美國咧就將會咧可能脫歐啊！咁啊，中國咧會咧經歷一個好大嘅經濟危機。因為我哋咧俾美國判斷咧就係一個出口型嘅經濟，咁冇咗美國呢個咁大嘅市場，我哋梗係好大鑊啦，係咪啊？咁啊美國人係咁樣諗嘢，咁啊阿高志凱就答咗俾佢 We don't care, we don't care 咁。咁啊呢排咧不停咧就喺外邊咧就做好多個訪問啊，好多人咧就即係問佢攞呢個咧中國嘅意見。咁啊我咧就坦白講，我真係唔係好清楚佢嗰個政治背景咧，同埋咧佢係咪能夠咧代表官方，又或者係半官方。就好似咧之前阿胡錫進咁，但係胡錫進都話晒咧都係環球時報啊，咁啊而家咧更加退咗落嚟，咁啊好似咧講嘢越嚟越偏鋒咁啊，咁啊但係咧高志凱咧究竟可以代表咩嘅立場咧？我唔係好清楚，我唔夠膽亂咁評論。咁啊另外咧畫面上邊咧另外一位咧就係西方人士啦，就係美國人啦，佢叫做咧 George Friedman。George Friedman 係咩咧？係一位地緣政治嘅專家嚟㗎。咁咧佢係對好多嘅美國嘅總統咧都係咧俾意見佢哋嚇，好似一個智囊咁樣噶。咁啊，即係呢啲人咧就對美國咧嘅影響力咧係有嘅。咁但係咧佢咧就睇咗好多，又或者可以咁講啦，幾十年咧喺美國嘅政界裏邊。咁啊，所以咧佢咧都可以又係好似頭先咁樣講啊，半官方定係唔能夠代表官方咁代表美國去講嘢咧，我都唔敢肯定。不過佢兩個個訪問嘅即係交鋒咧，喺個可以咁樣講啊，比較精彩啊！呢個所謂叫做精彩對壘。咁啊嗱，高 B 哥咧想放條片俾大家睇咗先，完咗之後咧，我就話俾你聽我嘅見解。呢位美國嘅地緣政治專家咧，可以咁樣講咧，朝朝武力啊，完全咧抵抗唔住，甚至乎咧答唔到嘅嘢咧，唯有咧顧左右而言他。最後咧，佢仲居然嚟一句係啊！我哋就係咁噶啦，咁點啊？真係居然可以去到咁樣嘅。好，大家睇個影片先。
Politics are pretty much driving Trump's tariffs. What are you making of the messaging that we're close to perhaps a major trade deal, and perhaps the messaging of the optimism that something will come out of the trade negotiations of the weekend within the U.S. and China?
Well, there's a fundamental issue with China that we don't have with other countries. We've become enormously dependent on Chinese imports, not only for low prices, which is of great value, but also as components in our industrial plant. There is a danger, as there was during the Arab oil embargo, that in spite of economic interests of the Arabs, they cut off oil to the United States. We don't expect the Chinese to do that. But we still have to understand that whereas there has to be a financial understanding, there also has to be a geopolitical understanding. The United States and China are mutually hostile in the security area. Not at war, but not friends. And there is always, in financial dealings, a weapon in finance and economics that can be used against the other country. The incredible dependency the United States has in Chinese low prices and efficiency opens the door that if the geopolitical situation shifts, China might limit exports to the United States as a weapon. And I think that has a major dimension to do with it. And this is not just a financial crisis with China, not just an economic one. There is a serious security and geopolitical issue that we have to address. Both have to be solved to solve this problem.
The thing is, both sides have acknowledged that such high tariffs are not sustainable it is in both countries' interests to make some progress on the trade tensions. Victor, given that the trade negotiations over the weekend in Switzerland is at a high level, what are the chances of some progress being achieved, even if it's just in terms of the positive messaging that may be sent across to the world?
Thank you very much for having me. For the Chinese high officials and the American counterparts to meet this weekend in Switzerland is, in my best judgment, a positive step in the right direction. However, if you read between the lines, the Chinese side does not call it a negotiation. They call it getting in touch with the United States at the request of the United States, meaning they want to tone down any expectation that whatever that comes out of Geneva or Switzerland will be of any great significance, because there is no negotiation. The Americans wanted to talk and China agreed to meet halfway. They do not want to go to Washington for the talk. They do not want to allow the Americans to come to Beijing for the talk. They want to go to Switzerland for the talk. And if you read how the Chinese frame it, they actually say the Chinese leader, Mr. He, will go to Switzerland for China-Swiss consultation to be followed with China-French consultation in Paris. And in between, they happen to be in Switzerland and they want to meet the American counterpart at the insistence of the United States. Now, what does this mean? My best reading is that China is fully committed to fight this trade war with the United States to the very end if the United States chooses to do so, or China wants to open the door for real negotiation on terms of equality, mutual respect, and for mutual benefit. So we are at this critical moment when China agrees to get in touch with the American counterparts for the possibility of real negotiations. Whatever that will happen in Switzerland will not be called real negotiation at all by any stretch of the imagination, but it will be absolutely in both China's interest and Americans' interest to scale down the tariffs to make sure that free trade prevails and no one should be allowed to weaponize trade or weaponize tariff or to throw a big wedge into free trade. This is the best message I can get out of this weekend's meeting in Switzerland.
George, do you agree it's not negotiations that we're seeing this weekend within the U.S. and China, bearing in mind as well that both have maintained a pretty hot stance in terms of what and how far they're willing to go?
I think whatever we call it, it's both sides talking to each other. And if you don't want to consider it negotiations, well, nothing will be settled here anyway. It has to go to much higher levels. But again, the Chinese are approaching this as basically a financial confrontation between the United States. There are more dimensions to this confrontation, and they will be risen. For the United States, there are two dimensions, and for the Chinese, there's only one. So that the more the Chinese try to limit this to financial issues, and the more they stand as if they don't have much to lose, as much to lose as the United States, which I don't think is true, the harder the negotiation will be. So whatever the Chinese formal position is, it is diplomatic preface. But the fact is, these are the first talks. What will come of them will be further negotiations. But the negotiations are going to be much more complex than with most other countries.
As you suggested, George, there's a lot to lose for China, but it does seem like China is also preparing itself for a long, drawn-out and tough negotiation process, because we've just seen from the PBOC all those measures which, were more than people expected. It does seem like it is trying to set its economy up for the long haul. Is that a fair assumption?
In any negotiation, you want to go in as if you don't need a deal and you have all the time in the world. Whether you're buying a house or a company, you don't go in there eager for a settlement. But it's very difficult for me to imagine that China, as dependent it is both on American trade and in the past on American investment, can afford to have a breakdown in economic relations with the United States. So I would say that what we are saying, what politicians say is that there is something they think and something they say. I tend to disregard what they say. I take a look at their position. And the Chinese can't afford, any more than the United States can, a long and extended conflict between them economically or politically and militarily.
Victor, we heard George say earlier that negotiations has to be brought up to a much higher level. By that, we mean perhaps, right, it has to be at the level of the two leaders. Here we're talking about Xi Jinping as well as Donald Trump. Can a deal be struck only at that level?
Well, a couple of points, very briefly. I think for China and the United States to yank the tariff against each other on the Chinese side up to 125%, on the American side to a higher percentage, cannot be done without the personal approval of the top leaders of each of these two great nations. That's the first point. The second point is China has declared again and again and again that if the United States want to manhandle this free trade issue, China is prepared to fight to the very end. Now, the question is, what is the very end? What are the possibilities of the very end? Let me really think aloud for the benefit of your audience. I think, according to the Chinese interpretation, one of the end will be the two-way trade between China and the United States grinding to a complete halt. That means there will be no more Chinese exports to the United States, and there will be no more U.S. export to China. Now, does China want to see this happen? Absolutely not. It's against China's own interest. But allow me to emphasize, China has another higher interest. That is free trade. China will never allow any country, no matter how powerful that country is, to really throw a huge wedge into free trade as if it can dictate terms to the rest of the world by holding a gun at China's head or any other country's head. That means the end will be a complete halt and termination of two-way traffic. Now, the United States probably says, well, I want to boycott Chinese exports to the United States or some of the Chinese export to the United States while continuing to have a free walk of American exports to China. That will be completely pipe dream. If it comes to a halt, it will be halting the two-way traffic at whatever economic cost to China, because China will believe that is the only right thing to do, and no country in the world should be allowed or permitted to fight and destroy free trade.
George, what's your take on the end that Victor was talking about? And could China be willing and happy to sacrifice its exports to the U.S. if it means gaining, a strategic footprint, a bigger footprint in the world?
Well, from my point of view, this is a very reasonable opening in negotiations. You both sit down and say, I don't need a deal. The price that China would pay for losing access to the American market would be substantial. So would the price that the Americans would pay. But if the Chinese are absolutely capable of cutting off supplies to the United States, that creates a greater imperative for the United States to back off Chinese trade. Then we must be self-sufficient. Then we must not be importing. So this threat by the Chinese is an argument against free trade in the sense that if some country shifts out of that, dangers can happen. And that's exactly what the United States is worried about in relation to China. And if it's what China is worried about the United States, then we can talk. So long as we both have the same fears, it's possible to reach an understanding of what will happen. And I think U.S. and China have the same fears. We both fear a breakdown in economic relationships. We both fear war between the two countries. We have much more in common just because each side is being inflexible. Then they will sit down and find a middle ground.
George, I want to refer to your book, The Storm Before the Calm, America's Discord, The Coming Crisis of the 2020s, where you talk about how the U.S. periodically reaches a point of crisis where it appears to be at war with itself, and it is about a country perhaps in transition, reinventing itself. The other take, of course, is whether or not it is actually in terminal decline. How are you looking at those two ideas?
When we look back at the Roosevelt period, or the Reagan period after the Vietnam War, it always appears that the United States is in decline, and the world sort of welcomes it. But the fact is that the United States is a country that invented itself. In our revolution, we created a constitution, and we reinvent ourselves as resources and as institutions become obsolete. So rather than having a long-term evolution, we have short-term crises. We had that when Reagan was elected 50 years before that when Roosevelt was elected, and so on and so forth. This is a healthy way in which the United States operates. It is not the way the rest of the world operates. And in this time, there is strife within the United States. Roosevelt was called a dictator, and he went to war with the Supreme Court. So I would say that this is the norm for the United States. It is not the norm for other countries. And they draw imperfect conclusions if they think this represents weakness in the United States. This is one of the strengths of the United States. We're not afraid to have chaos in the process of reinvention.
Victor, even as we cast our eyes at the upcoming U.S.-China trade talks this weekend, the U.S. itself is in the midst of negotiating with at least a dozen economies. I'm just wondering, what's the take from China, given that there is a sense that the U.S. is likely to gather its trading partners and try to isolate China, especially on the issue of chips?
First of all, allow me to mention one point from the depth of my heart. For China, with its size, with its strength, with its deliverability, and with its 5,000 years of history, when we hear about any country or any groups of countries talking about isolating China, do you know what's the response? We chuckle. Because from my perspective, it's a mission impossible. You dare to isolate China? You're talking about kind of isolating the world in a sense. China is the largest trading partner with more than 140 nations in the world. And you want to isolate China? You want to really break up all these economic relations? It's a fantasy. Never try that, because otherwise you'll end up in great failure. Now, on the other hand, yes, we know that the United States is talking with many countries, but for the United States to launch this unprecedented, largest scale tariff war or trade war, it's like holding a gun at every country's head and say, kneel down and talk to me on my terms and don't strike me back. Now, every country faces different circumstances. Many countries, it will not be surprising, will need to give in to the pressure of the United States. But you ask them in the bottom of their heart, in the depth of the night, whether they like to have a gun pointed at their head. I can assure you, based on all my education, all my judgment, all my sanity, all my wisdom, no country likes to have a gun pointed at their head to negotiate with the United States. Therefore, I hope I can tell President Trump and people around him, don't struggle against free trade. Follow the principle of free trade. And the United States seems to be a standard bearer of free trade for many decades.
Right.
Now, the standard falls into the hands of China, and China wants to be the champion and the standard bearer of free trade. This is the difference we are talking about.
Lots of complications for the world right now, including what's happening in South Asia, the conflict between India and Pakistan. George, let's start with you. When it comes to the role that the U.S. can play, how do you think it can, what can it do to help de-escalate the tensions there?
Well, the United States wants to not dominate the world, not frighten the world, not point hands. It wants to pull back from the world. For the last 80 years, the United States has been in a Cold War, a war that frequently turned hot, where many Americans died, other countries died. And the United States has the ability not to reshape the world, but to reshape itself. And one of the features of the United States that makes it such great power is when it reshapes itself and it reshapes its relationship with the world seems shocked, as if it's unreasonable. But we have been in a Cold War for a long time, and that's why we are trying to negotiate with the Russians and back out of this war with Ukraine. And this is why we're trying to negotiate with the Chinese. So if the Chinese don't want to negotiate, well, that's their choice. But it is American options for what they want to do that is driving this. It is not holding a gun to the head. It is trying to take a different course in history.
好啦，嗱，翻嚟啦吓，喂，係咪睇到咧佢哋咧點樣精彩嘅對壘？不過咧有啲牛頭唔搭馬嘴啊！大家咧想講咧，大家各自立場嘅嘢，咁啊，但係咧你都可以咧透過呢個影片咧，可以了解美國人嗰個心態咧去到邊度。咁啊，佢啊去到最尾嗰度咧講咗兩個重點啊。第一個重點咧就話咧，成日都相信咧美國係一個咧自我改革能力好強嘅國家。咁啊，我哋咧知道有問題發生咗，但係咧唔使擔心，因為我哋咧有個自我改革嘅能力，係咪？咁啊，我啊想話俾呢位George 聽咧，其實咧呢個世界裏邊咧冇一個國家咧係冇自我改革嘅，只係話咧你話咧去到個能力有幾高咧，咁啊我只能夠咁講啦。以往嘅美國咧真係唔差嘅。但係而家嘅美國咧，我就好懷疑啦，因為咧實在咧有太多太複雜嘅因素影響，就淨係你兩黨喺度鬥生鬥死嗰下，就已經搞死你美國啦。再加埋你而家面對緊嘅就係你而家面對個美債嘅問題係最眼前嘅嘢，美國國債啊 ，OK， 再加埋咧你個美元霸權亦都出現咗問題喺度㗎。再加埋咧，你個美軍嘅實力亦都出現咗問題喺度㗎，係咪？所以以往你可以禮橫節曲，可以洗橫手，可以用壓制壓榨嘅方法嚟去做。Sorry 喎，而家可能睇唔到你呢個能力咯。嗱，另外咧，我想同大家咧分享咧，阿 Mark Rubio 啊，呢個叫做 Marco Rubio 啊，即係咧阿盧比奧咧。佢咧啱啱又上咗去接受另一個訪問咧，就對美國一個媒體，唔係媒體啦，佢哋一個記者叫 The Free Press 啊，咁大家可以去睇下嚇，我睇下我可唔可以攞到片同大家去分享，因為咧我有英文片，不過咧就冇中文字幕嘅，不過咧如果擺喺 YouTube 上面，其實都會有呢個中文字幕出嚟，咁啊嗰條片又係精彩嘅，因為咧阿盧比奧咧講得好清楚佢哋嘅立場，佢哋嘅 stance 係點樣。但係咧，佢哋個立場啦，坦白講，你聽完之後咧，佢真係冇錯。你企喺呢個美國人嘅角度，真係冇錯。甚至乎咧，佢之前咧都有喺度喺中間答問嘅時候咧，都話咧佢認同咧阿特朗普嗰個講法就係，其實我哋真係冇怪中國，因為如果我哋企喺中國嘅立場，我哋係中國人，我哋係中國嘅領導人，我哋都會咁樣做。點解你俾咗嗰個機會我去咁樣去做，我唔做啊？我梗係唔會放棄咁蠢啦。所以咧，佢話我哋冇怪佢嘅，咁但係佢出嘅手法啦，所有嘅成咧，就係諗住咧用翻以往嗰套。不過睇嚟真係唔係幾 work 咯。就係正如咧我頭先所講嗰一大紮嘅原因。咁啊，呢位阿 George 咧，佢咧仲用緊咧幾廿年前嘅地緣政治嘅諗法啦。所以佢去到最尾就話咧，係啊，呢個高志海同佢講就話，喂，我哋冇人。甚至乎每一個國家都唔願意同你傾㗎，因為你而家好似個方法係揾支槍指住我哋，一定要用你嘅方法，用你嘅方式同你去所謂叫做傾，有乜好傾啊？如果咁樣嘅話，係咪？你簡單講就係夾我哋。咁佢最後都駁你唔到啊！佢就話：哎呀，我哋喺歷史上面都係咁樣啊！我哋自我改革能力好強噶，我哋咧就會用呢啲方法噶。咁啊，每一個國家咧都有權咧用佢哋自己嘅方法，我哋去改變嘅歷史嘅軌跡。啊，好多國家可能咧認為我哋呢個方法咧就唔行得通啊，或者咧好討厭啊、好厭惡啊、唔喜歡啊。啊，甚至乎咧我哋咧認為咧裏邊嘅混亂咧係我哋不嬲都接受噶。我哋之前都試過幾個總統嘅時候咧，我哋都係去到咁混亂噶啦。我哋個總統係同最高法院咧去打噶，我哋係咁樣噶。你哋咧可能咧行唔通，或者你哋唔會用呢個方法，但係我哋得噶。我哋有權用我哋呢個方法去做咁樣話。喂，你又講廢話？你自己改革自己啊，梗係得啦。你而家改革緊人哋啊嘛，你拉人哋落水啊嘛，呢個係國際嘅事務嚟噶嘛。所以咧，我就話呢啲人咧，而家嘅政治能量、政治嘅能力咧，好低啊，係咪？就係以為咧，我哋用我個方法係嘛？我係咁噶啦，咁最後咪點啊？最後咪可以唔就範咯。就所以去到特朗普最後要講嗰句就話：唔使傾啦，得啦，我講幾多就幾多啦。 最終嘅辦法就係你就範就範，唔就範嘅就拉倒，係嘛？大家就冇得傾啦，冇得再去啦。係啊，就係咁啊。咁你會發覺你美國好大鑊咯，係咪？嗱，當然啦，你成日都講我可以承受嗰啲損失，我可以承受嗰個錯，咁冇嘢好講。你經常性都咁樣做，而家就係大家希望喺中間攞到一個調和，係大家都可以接受嘅。嗱，甚至乎你講你美國，喂，我想做翻嗰個所謂叫再工業化，工業要回歸，可能冇人攔住你噶。不過你唔好成日諗住喺咁短時間，盧比奧嗰個訪問咧就最好啦。佢話我哋知道咧，可能咧呢個再工業化咧係需要10年、15年、20年，但係我哋冇呢個時間啊！我哋要1-2年裏邊就做起嚟啊！呢啲簡直係痴心妄想嘅嘢嚟噶。你同業界嗰邊傾下先啦。喺你哋最強勢嘅時代，都唔可能喺1-2年裏邊做嘅嘢出嚟，點可能喺而家弱勢嘅情況之下，居然會咁樣做啫？佢話係啊，我哋就係冇我哋個再造業嗰個叫造船業。佢直情好坦白咁講，我哋輸俾中國個造船業。佢話我哋唔係唔願意俾錢落去做，我哋真係冇咗呢啲技術，因為佢話有啲行業咧已經係 long gone away 啊，即係已經係離開咗我哋好耐，我哋冇呢個能力做啊。佢直情咁樣講，所以點解特朗普就要用夾人哋嘅方法，夾人哋過嚟喺我哋呢度投資，希望幫我哋美國重建我哋嘅工業化，就係咁樣啦。咁啊〜總之咧，如果揾到嗰個影片，就同大家分享啦。如果唔係，你哋自己去揾嚟睇，好冇？咁啊，呢位嘅地緣政治專家，俾你睇到嘅態度咧，簡直咧係差嘅。即係佢唔係差嘅，坦白講，佢真係答你唔到。佢唯有咧顧左右而言他，佢唯有咧就話俾你聽，係啊，我哋係咁樣做噶啦。我哋咁樣做，有啲國家可能唔接受，覺得好厭惡、好討厭，但係我哋都要咁樣做噶。冇辦法，因為我哋相信我哋自己嘅自我改革能力。我就即係唔好話教精你，我提醒你啊！你頭先我講嘅一大扎嘢，你已經係今非昔比噶啦。而家唔可以再係好似以前嗰套。你成日話其他國家想行以前嗰套，你而家又自我改革，但係實際上係你行翻去以前30-40年前嗰套，係咪？仲以為係第二次世界大戰完咗之後，又或者係冷戰啱啱完咗之後，你美國可以世界上面呼風喚雨嘅年代 ？Sorry 咯，真係唔係呢一回事嚟噶。所以咧，高志海咧講咗大扎嘢咧，佢咧就即刻立個定論就話：呢個咧作為一個開場白係好好嘅，係咪？咁啊，我哋明白咗你嗰個意見嘅，但係我哋都要咁樣做，即係咁點啊？即係冇彎轉咯。因為點解啊？因為佢真係冇辦法啊嘛，佢簡單啲講，我哋香港人成日講啊，佢冇符啊，而家佢冇符啊，咁有咩辦法啫？佢咪唯有咁樣做咯。所以咧，你見到咧，就肯定咧，好似阿教授嗰個影片咁講，美國咧係預咗要兩敗俱傷，而家我哋就唔俾佢玩兩敗俱傷。究竟點樣可以勒到佢唔好做兩敗俱傷咧？真係咧要睇我哋咧領導人嘅智慧噶。好啦。片暫時咧就分享咁多，咁啊跟住我再會揾一啲咧覺得有價值嘅影片同大家分享。如果唔係嘅話咧，你哋咧喺下邊留言啊嚇，喺下邊留言咧講一講你哋對呢個影片嘅睇法，同埋咧你覺得咧點樣去對付呢個美國咧？即係禮橫嚟，係啊，我哋就係咁樣做噶啦，呢種方法。不過我成日都講，你用理性嘅方法去諗，或者理性嘅角度去諗。一啲唔理智嘅人，係啊，我係要咁噶。有陣時咧，真係好難諗得通啊！我自豪，因我多角度思考，晏啲再見，拜拜。